The massive space station hung in the void like a crystalline flower, its 12 arms stretching out toward distant stars. Each section housed different atmospheric zones for the galaxy's most diverse species. This was the Galactic Preparatory Academy, where the children of admirals, generals, and planetary governors came to learn the art of war. For 300 years, no human had ever walked these halls. Kim Day pressed his face against the transport shuttle's porthole, watching. The academy grew larger as they approached. The docking bay alone was bigger than most Earth cities, filled with sleek alien vessels that looked more like living creatures than machines. Vrathari warships resembled giant beetles with energy cannons instead of horns. Nexari craft were transparent, pyramids that hummed with crystalline resonance. The golem vessels were simply massive chunks of asteroid that had been hollowed out and fitted with engines. His own transport shuttle looked like scrap metal in comparison. "Final approach to Academy Station," announced the pilot, a four-armed Centaurian whose voice sounded like grinding gears. "Human passenger, you sure about this? Last chance to turn around." Day shook his head. "I'm sure." The pilot's mechanical laugh echoed through the cabin. "Your funeral, soft skin." The docking process took nearly an hour. Day watched through the viewports as alien students moved through the station's corridors like schools of exotic fish. Some floated using anti-gravity organs, others skittered along the walls with multiple legs, and a few glided through specialized atmospheric zones that would kill most other species in seconds. When the airlock finally opened, Day stepped into a world that assaulted every sense at once. The Academy's main concourse was a vast spherical chamber with walkways spiraling in all directions. Gravity fields shifted depending on species requirements, so beings walked on floors, walls, and ceilings simultaneously. The air itself was divided into sections, some areas thick with methane for the gas breathers, others superheated for the silicon-based life forms, and narrow corridors of Earth-normal atmosphere for the few species that shared similar requirements. Day's arrival had clearly been announced. As he walked through the designated human zone, conversations stopped. Hundreds of alien eyes, sensors, and consciousness fields focused on him with uncomfortable intensity. "Look at how small it is," chittered an insect-like hive mind student. "Its translator collar, converting the clicks into standard galactic." "Are we certain this is a fully grown specimen?" A Vrathari warrior nearly twice Day's height leaned down for a closer look. "The skin appears so fragile, I could tear it with a single claw." The alien's 4 arms were thick as tree trunks, each ending in hands that could crush steel. Battle scars covered every inch of its reptilian hide. "Perhaps it's some kind of larval stage," suggested a floating Nexari, its crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns. "Surely the adult forms are more impressive." Day kept walking, his single duffel bag feeling increasingly inadequate. Around him, other students moved equipment that would outfit small armies. The Vrathari traveled with weapon racks, armor stands, and training dummies made from exotic metals. The Nexari transported resonance chambers that could simulate their home planet's crushing pressures. Even the smaller species carried technological marvels that Earth scientists could barely comprehend. He had packed 3 changes of clothes, some basic hygiene supplies, and his grandfather's old military knife. The dormitory assignment area was controlled chaos. Massive golem students required reinforced chambers with triple-strength floors. The aquatic depth dwellers needed pressurized water tanks. The energy-based flux beings existed in specialized containment fields that hummed with barely contained power. "Next," called out the assignment officer, a spider-like creature with 12 arms simultaneously operating different computer interfaces. "Species designation?" "Human," Day replied. Every arm stopped moving. The spider being's cluster of eyes focused on him with obvious confusion. "Human? I don't have atmospheric requirements for... Let me check the database." Several arms began typing frantically. Oh my! You breathe the same mixture as Centaurians. How convenient, you can share their section." A group of nearby Centaurian students burst into mechanical laughter. "The soft flesh will room with us? This should be entertaining. Try not to die in your sleep, little human." The dormitory corridors were dimly lit and filled with the sound of alien machinery. Day's room was a small cube with basic furniture and an atmospheric processor that hummed constantly. Through the walls he could hear his neighbors, the sound of Vrathari combat practice, the harmonic singing of Nexari meditation, and the grinding mechanical conversations of Centaurian engineering students. He unpacked his few belongings, hung his clothes in a closet designed for beings twice his size, and sat on the bed that felt more like a stone slab. A soft chime indicated an incoming message on his room's communication panel. The Academy's daily schedule appeared on the screen, listing classes that seemed impossible for someone of his size and strength: advanced combat theory, tactical engineering, and tomorrow morning, his first physical training session. Outside his window, the Academy's central courtyard was filled with alien students practicing various forms of warfare. Vrathari warriors battled each other with energy weapons that left scorch marks on reinforced walls. Nexari students moved in perfect formation, their crystalline bodies creating geometric patterns that somehow enhanced their combat effectiveness. Golem cadets threw massive boulders at targets hundreds of meters away. Day watched for a long time, studying their techniques and noting their weaknesses. Every species had advantages that made them formidable, but they also had patterns, limitations, and blind spots. Tomorrow would be interesting. He activated his room's privacy screen and began his evening exercise routine, the same one his grandfather had taught him. Passed down through generations of Korean soldiers who had learned that true strength came not from size or technology, but from the refusal to quit when everything seemed impossible. The other students were placing bets on his survival. They were about to learn why humans had earned their place among the stars. Dawn broke over the Academy with the artificial light of 3 different suns, each calibrated for different species' circadian rhythms. Kim Dae had been awake for an hour, quietly doing stretches in his cramped quarters while listening to the sounds of his alien doormates preparing for the day. The Centaurians were already running diagnostics on their mechanical limbs, their hydraulic systems hissing and clicking. Down the hall, a Vrathari student was sharpening his natural claws against a whetstone that rang like a bell with each stroke. The gymnasium complex was a marvel that defied Earth physics. The main chamber stretched upward for nearly a kilometer, its ceiling lost in artificial clouds that rained different atmospheric mixtures for various training zones. Gravity generators hummed beneath the floor, creating fields that could simulate everything from the crushing pull of a neutron star to the weightless void of deep space. When Dai entered the main training area, conversations stopped. Alien students, who had been warming up, turned to stare at the human who had somehow survived his first night without requesting a transfer home. The betting pools had already shifted. Most wagers now focused on whether he would last through the morning or collapse during the first exercise. Professor Keksvar stood at the center of the gymnasium like a monument to warfare. The ancient Vrathari instructor bore scars from conflicts across the galaxy, plasma burns that had fused his scales into metallic patterns, missing chunks of hide where Nexari crystal weapons had carved away flesh, and a mechanical replacement for his left arm that had been torn off during the Rim Wars. His remaining 3 natural arms were each strong enough to crush starship hull plating. "Gather around, younglings," Keksvar's voice boomed across the chamber, translated instantly into dozens of languages by floating communication drones. "Today, we separate the warriors from the pretenders." The assembled students represented the galaxy's most formidable species. Thoxra, the Vrathari champion, stood head and shoulders above the rest. His natural armor plating gleamed with oil that enhanced conductivity for his bioelectric attacks. Beside him, Zilf, the Nexari student, hummed at frequencies that made the air itself vibrate, her crystalline body refracting light into weapon-grade laser bursts. A massive golem student named Roktar simply stood motionless like a living boulder, his stone skin proof against most known weapons. And then there was Day, looking impossibly small among giants. "We begin with basic strength assessment," Keksvar announced, gesturing toward a pull-up station that looked more like a torture device. The bar was made from compressed neutronium, designed to support beings who weighed several tons. "Pull-ups to failure. No rest periods, no assistance." Thoxra approached first, his forearms gripping the bar in perfect formation. The massive Vrathari began his set with mechanical precision, each repetition smooth and controlled. His muscles, enhanced by generations of genetic optimization for warfare, worked like hydraulic pistons. The crowd counted along as he passed. 50, then 100, then 150 repetitions without slowing. At 203 pull-ups, Thoxera finally dropped to the ground, barely breathing hard. The Vrathari students roared approval, while other species showed their own forms of respectful acknowledgement. Acceptable, Kexvar noted, making marks on his electronic tablet. Next. Zilf floated to the bar, her crystalline body shifting into optimal configuration for the exercise. Nexari physiology was completely different from carbon-based life. Instead of muscles, they used resonance fields to manipulate their molecular structure. She completed 73 perfect pull-ups before her harmonic frequencies began to destabilize, forcing her to stop. One by one, the alien students demonstrated abilities that would have been impossible on Earth. Roktar's massive stone body managed 45 repetitions despite weighing over a ton. A group of hive-mind insects worked together as a single organism to complete nearly 300 collective pull-ups. Even the smallest species displayed strength-to-weight ratios that defied conventional physics. Finally, all eyes turned to Day. The human walked to the bar slowly, ignoring the whispered comments and barely contained laughter from the audience. His hands, soft by alien standards, gripped the neutronium surface. The bar felt cold against his palms, and he could already feel the beginning of friction burns. Day began his set. His first 10 repetitions were clean, but clearly required effort. Unlike the aliens who had genetic modifications or exotic physiology, he was just using ordinary human muscle and bone. At 20 repetitions, his breathing became more pronounced. At 30, sweat began to bead on his forehead. Poor creature. Is already failing, someone whispered in a language the translation drones picked up. How embarrassing for his species. But Day kept going. 40 repetitions, 45, 50. The whispers stopped. Something was wrong with this picture. The human should have reached failure by now. His muscles should be screaming, his form should be breaking down, and he should be gasping for air, like other carbon-based life forms did, when pushed beyond their limits. Instead, Day's breathing remained steady. His form stayed perfect. His grip never wavered. At 60 repetitions, Professor Kexavar began paying attention. At 70, he stopped, watching other students and focused entirely on the human. By 80 repetitions, the entire gymnasium had gone silent except for the sound of Day's body moving through space. Blood began to seep through his shirt where the bar was cutting into his hands. Any sane creature would have stopped, would have requested medical attention, would have acknowledged that they had reached their limit. Day kept going. 90 repetitions. 100. 110. The alien students were no longer laughing. Some were backing away from the pull-up station as if the human had become dangerous. Others were frantically accessing their personal datapads, pulling up information about human physiology that they had never bothered to study before. Impossible, breathed Thoxera, his champion status suddenly feeling less secure. No creature that size should be able to continue. But continue Day did. His hands were leaving bloody marks on the bar now, and his shirt was soaked with sweat and blood. His breathing had become slightly labored, but it remained controlled, measured like a machine operating within acceptable parameters. Professor Kexavar checked his chronometer. 2 hours had passed since the exercise began. 2 hours of continuous repetitions without rest, without complaint, without any sign that the human understood the concept of giving up. The other students had long since completed their assessments and moved on to other stations, but they kept glancing back at the human who simply would not stop. Some of the younger aliens looked disturbed, as if they were witnessing something that violated the natural order of the universe. At 250 repetitions, Day finally slowed. His form began to waver slightly, and his breathing became more audible. The watching aliens leaned forward, expecting him to finally collapse and prove that humans had limits like everyone else. Instead, Day adjusted his grip, took 3 deep breaths, and continued with renewed precision. Professor Kexvar's scarred face showed an expression that none of his students had ever seen before. It might have been fear. The Academy's combat arena was a technological marvel that put Earth's greatest stadiums to shame. Built into the station's central core, the spherical chamber could simulate any environment in the known galaxy. Holographic projectors created realistic battlefields, while gravity generators and atmospheric processors adjusted conditions to match different worlds. Spectator galleries surrounded the arena in concentric rings, each section designed for different species' viewing preferences. Word had spread throughout the station about the strange human who refused to quit during physical training. Now, 3 days later, beings from every corner of the Academy had gathered to watch his first combat trial. The betting boards displayed odds that heavily favored his alien opponent, with some bookmakers offering 1,000-to-1 payouts for a human victory. Kim Day stood in the preparation chamber, adjusting the standard-issue training armor that had been modified to fit his smaller frame. Through the transparent walls, he could see the arena floor being configured for the match. The environment selector had chosen a rocky desert terrain similar to the Vrathari homeworld, complete with jagged stones and unstable footing that would favor his opponent's natural advantages. "Nervous, Softskin?" asked a Centaurian medical technician as she attached monitoring sensors to Day's body. "These readings will help us know when to stop the match before permanent damage occurs." "I'm fine," Day replied, though his heart rate had indeed elevated slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. He had spent the past 3 days studying combat footage from the Academy's archives, analyzing how different species fought and identifying patterns that could be exploited. The arena doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Day stepped onto the simulated battlefield. The artificial gravity felt heavier than Earth normal, designed to replicate the crushing pull of the Vrathari homeworld. Rocky spires jutted up from red sand that shifted treacherously underfoot. Twin suns blazed overhead, creating harsh shadows and temperature variations that would tax most species' endurance. On the opposite side of the arena, Nam Te emerged from his preparation chamber like a walking tank. The second-year Vrathari student stood nearly 9 feet tall, his natural armor plating gleaming with bio-oils that enhanced his already formidable defenses. 4 massive arms ended in clawed hands that could tear through starship hull plating, his reptilian eyes fixed on Day with predatory focus. The spectator galleries erupted in a cacophony of sounds as different species showed their approval. Vrathari students roared their battle cries, creating a sound like thunder that shook the arena walls. Nexari observers chimed in harmonic frequencies that made the air itself vibrate. Even the normally stoic Golem students showed their interest by shifting their massive stone bodies forward for better viewing angles. "Combat Trial 774, announced the arena's automated referee system. "Standard rules apply. Victory by submission, unconsciousness, or medical intervention. Combatants, acknowledge readiness." "Ready," Tay growled, his voice carrying across the arena despite the distance. "Ready," Day replied, his quieter voice amplified by the audio system. "Begin combat." Tay moved with surprising speed for his size, his 4 arms pumping as he charged across the uneven terrain. Sand sprayed behind his massive feet as he closed the distance in seconds. His opening attack was a classic Vrathari technique called the crushing embrace. All 4 arms would wrap around an opponent and squeeze until bones shattered and organs ruptured. Day had seen this move in the archive footage. He knew it was coming. What the spectators expected was a quick grab, a brief struggle, and then the inevitable sound of breaking bones as the human learned why Vrathari were feared throughout the galaxy as close combat specialists. What they got instead was something none of them had ever seen before. As Tay's arms closed around him, Day didn't try to break free or match strength against strength. Instead, he flowed like water, shifting his body weight and using leverage to redirect Tay's momentum. His elbow found a nerve cluster just behind Tay's primary shoulder joint, a vulnerable spot that existed in Vrathari anatomy, but was rarely targeted because most opponents never survived long enough to exploit it. Tay's grip loosened slightly as pain shot through his nervous system. In that split second of weakness, Day twisted free and landed a series of precise strikes against pressure, points that his research had identified. Each blow was calculated to disrupt Ty's balance and coordination rather than cause massive damage. The Vrathari student stumbled backward, confusion replacing confidence. No opponent had ever escaped his crushing embrace, much less counterattacked, with such precision. "Impossible," breathed a Vrathari instructor in the spectator gallery. "The human is too small to generate enough force for those strikes to be effective." But effective they were. Tay shook his massive head, trying to clear the disorientation, and launched another attack. This time he used his reach advantage, keeping his distance while lashing out with clawed swipes that could decapitate most beings. Day moved like smoke, dodging attacks that missed him by millimeters. When he couldn't avoid a strike completely, he rolled with the impact, using Tay's own force against him. Claws that should have torn him apart instead glanced off at angles that dissipated their power. The match continued for 10 minutes, then 15, then 20. Tay grew increasingly frustrated as his powerful attacks failed to connect decisively. Meanwhile, Day continued his methodical assault on nerve clusters, joint vulnerabilities, and balance points that gradually wore down his massive opponent. Blood ran from multiple cuts where Tay's claws had found their mark. But Day seemed to function normally, despite injuries that should have incapacitated him. His movements remained precise, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. "Why won't it fall down?" demanded a Nexari student whose crystalline voice carried clearly through the arena's acoustics. Those wounds should have triggered shock responses in any carbon-based life form. In the 22nd minute of combat, Day finally saw his opening. Tay had overextended during a particularly aggressive attack, leaving himself off balance on the treacherous terrain. Day dropped low, swept Ty's legs with a move that used the Vrathari's own massive weight against him, and followed up with a strike to a neural junction at the base of Ty's skull. The giant Vrathari crashed to the arena floor like a falling mountain. His body convulsed once, then lay still. The arena fell absolutely silent. Day stood over his fallen opponent, blood dripping from his wounds onto the red sand. He swayed slightly from blood loss and exhaustion, but remained upright, alert, and ready to continue fighting if necessary. In the spectator galleries, Professor Kexvar fumbled for his datapad with shaking hands. His scarred fingers tapped frantically as he accessed files that had been gathering digital dust in the Academy's databases. Comprehensive biological surveys of species throughout the galaxy, including detailed reports on humanity's homeworld. What? He read there made his reptilian blood run cold. Earth wasn't just another world where intelligent life had evolved. It was what xenobiologists classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet where everything from the gravity to the weather to the wildlife was actively trying to kill every living thing on its surface. The biological survey described creatures that made Vrathari look fragile, natural disasters that occurred with terrifying regularity, and evolutionary pressures so intense that only the most adaptable species could survive. "Death world," Kexvar whispered, his voice lost in the arena's continued silence. They evolved on a death world. Humans weren't just tough. They were the products of millions of years of natural selection on a planet that treated survival as a daily examination with no margin for error, and now one of them was standing in their arena, having just defeated one of their finest warriors. The implications were staggering. The Academy's communication networks hummed with activity, as word of Namtai's defeat spread across the station like a digital plague. Within hours, every student, instructor and support staff member had watched the combat footage multiple times. The betting pools that had once mocked the human now sat abandoned, their odds calculations meaningless in the face of what they had witnessed. Kim Day walked through the Academy corridors the next morning, completely unaware of the fear he was generating. Conversation stopped when he approached, then resumed in hushed whispers once he passed. Groups of alien students who had previously blocked his path now pressed themselves against the walls, giving him a wide berth as if he carried some invisible contagion. In his advanced tactical theory class, Professor Zilmore, an elderly Nexari instructor whose crystalline body had dulled with age, found himself unable to concentrate on the lesson plan. His harmonic frequencies wavered whenever he looked at the small human sitting quietly in the front row, taking notes with the same methodical precision. he had shown in combat. "Today we study the Battle of Kepler's Ridge," Zilmore announced, his voice carrying the slight tremor that age brought to his species. "Can anyone identify the key tactical error made by the human forces?" The question was meant to be routine, part of a standard curriculum that had been taught for decades. But now, with an actual human present, it felt different, dangerous somehow. Day raised his hand politely. The human commander chose to divide his forces when faced with superior numbers. However, the historical records show this was intentional. He was using his own troops as bait to draw the enemy into a killing field prepared by civilian volunteers. The classroom fell silent. The other students exchanged nervous glances. They had all studied this battle, but none had caught that detail. More disturbing was the casual way the human discussed using civilians as military assets, as if such concepts were perfectly normal to his species. "Yes," Zilmore managed. "That is correct." Meanwhile, in the faculty emergency meeting that had been called for the third time this week, panic was spreading among the Academy's instructors like an infectious disease. The main conference room's holographic displays showed scrolling data about Earth and its inhabitants, information that painted an increasingly terrifying picture. Professor Veltar, whose usual confidence had been replaced by barely controlled fear, gestured at atmospheric composition charts with one of his 4 manipulator arms. "Look at these oxygen levels. 21% free oxygen in their atmosphere. That concentration would cause combustion reactions in most of our technology. Their entire planet is essentially a fuel-air explosive, waiting to ignite. The gravity readings are even worse," added Dr. Keth Rain, a golem geologist whose stone body had developed stress fractures from anxiety. 9.8 meters per second squared. That's nearly double galactic standard. Every step this human takes, he's carrying the equivalent of another person on his back. Every movement requires twice the energy we're used to generating. But it was the biological survey data that truly frightened them. Professor Hexana, the Academy's xenobiology specialist, had spent the entire night reviewing Earth's ecosystem reports, and what she found defied conventional understanding of how evolution was supposed to work. "Their predator-to-prey ratios are completely inverted," she said, her insectoid voice clicking with distress. "On most worlds, herbivores outnumber carnivores by factors of hundreds or thousands. On Earth, the numbers are almost equal. Everything eats everything else. The entire biosphere is locked in constant warfare." Director Quantos, whose massive stone body usually radiated calm authority, seemed smaller somehow as he studied the data. His glowing amber eyes dimmed as he processed implications that challenged everything he thought he knew about galactic civilization. "Show them the predator files," he rumbled. Hexana's manipulator arms moved across her console, bringing up holographic displays of Earth's apex predators. The assembled faculty watched in horrified fascination as images of creatures that seemed designed by nightmare paraded before them. Sharks that had remained unchanged for millions of years because they had achieved perfect killing efficiency. Big cats that could leap impossible distances and crush skulls with their jaws. Bears that weighed as much as small spacecraft and could run faster than most Academy speeders. "And humans," Hexana continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "evolved alongside all of these, not as prey, but as competitors." The room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the distant sound of the station's rotation. Each faculty member was processing the same terrifying realization. They had invited an apex predator from a death world to study warfare among their children. "There's more," Professor Kexvar said, his scarred hide showing stress patterns that hadn't appeared since his combat days. "I've been researching their military history. They don't just fight other species for resources or territory. They fight each other, constantly, for ideas, for religions, for concepts that exist only in their minds." He brought up historical data that made the assembled aliens recoil in shock. Human conflicts numbered in the thousands, spanning their entire recorded history, wars that lasted for decades, consuming entire generations. Battles fought with such intensity that they scarred their planet's surface and poisoned vast areas for centuries. They call it the Great War, the World War, The Cold War, HFY continued. They have names for their conflicts because there are so many of them, and each war teaches them new ways to kill more efficiently. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what they discovered about human physiology. Dr. Medrix, the Academy's chief medical officer, had finally completed his analysis of the combat footage, measuring Day's performance against known biological limits. He sustained injuries that should have incapacitated any carbon-based life form, Medrix reported, his multiple eyes dilating with stress. Lacerations that cut through muscle tissue, impact trauma that should have fractured bones, blood, loss that should have triggered unconsciousness. He functioned normally throughout the entire encounter. Pain tolerance, asked Director Quantos. Off our measurement scales, humans appear to have evolved redundant pain management systems that allow them to function while severely injured. It's as if their nervous systems are designed for continuous damage and repair. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every species in the Academy had evolved on worlds where cooperation and specialization led to success. They had developed advanced technologies and complex societies because working together was more efficient than fighting. Humans had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them, where cooperation meant survival and individual toughness determined who lived long enough to reproduce. They were persistence hunters who had literally run their prey to death across continents, developing endurance that allowed them to outlast creatures much larger and stronger than themselves. And now one of them was attending classes, making friends, and politely asking questions about galactic military history. Back in the dormitory corridors, Day noticed that his Centaurian roommate had moved out during the night, leaving only a brief message about family emergencies that required immediate attention. 3 other students on his floor had also mysteriously transferred to different sections of the station. He found Li Bo, a shy Nexari student, struggling with a mathematics assignment in the common area. The crystalline being's harmonic frequencies were fluctuating with frustration as he tried to solve orbital mechanics problems. "Need help?" Day asked, sitting down beside him. Bo's entire body went rigid with fear, his crystalline structure nearly shattering from shock. But politeness protocols in his species prevented him from simply fleeing, so he nodded weakly. Day spent the next hour patiently explaining the mathematical concepts, sharing his own notes, and even offering some of his meal rations when he noticed Bo hadn't eaten all day. His behavior was exactly what humans would consider normal courtesy: helping a struggling classmate, sharing resources, being kind to someone having difficulties. To Bo, it felt like being mentored by a predator who was playing with his food before consuming it. The kindness was somehow more terrifying than the violence had been. The Kethmore wilderness stretched across an entire moon, a nightmare landscape that had been transformed into the galaxy's most brutal testing ground. Ancient terraforming equipment had gone haywire centuries ago, creating an environment where every natural law seemed designed to kill unwary travelers. Crystal formations grew overnight, reshaping the terrain while students slept. Atmospheric processes leaked toxic gases that created invisible death zones. Gravity wells shifted randomly, turning simple walks into deadly obstacle courses. Kim Day stood at the edge of the drop zone, watching as military transports deposited students across the wilderness at predetermined intervals. Each cadet would face the trial alone, with nothing but basic survival gear and emergency beacons that would summon rescue teams if activated. Using the beacon meant automatic failure and expulsion from the academy. The mortality rate for the final examination was 12%. Every year, some of the galaxy's brightest young warriors simply disappeared into the crystalline maze. Their bodies never recovered. "Remember," announced Professor Kexvar over the transport's communication system, "this is not a group exercise. You succeed or fail based on your individual merit. Rescue points are located throughout the wilderness. Reach any extraction zone within 72 hours and you pass." The transport's cargo bay opened, revealing the alien landscape below. Jagged crystal spires jutted up from purple sand dunes like frozen lightning. In the distance, atmospheric, storms crackled with energy that could fry electronics or cook organic tissue. The air itself seemed to shimmer with hazardous particles. One by one, Students dropped from the transport using their species' preferred insertion methods. Vrathari warriors activated personal gravitic dampeners and fell like controlled meteors. Nexari students phased their crystalline bodies to match the terrain's resonance frequency and simply stepped through the transport wall. Golem cadets didn't bother with equipment at all, trusting their stone bodies to survive impacts that would shatter other species. Day checked his gear one final time: standard survival kit, emergency rations, water purifier, basic medical supplies, and a location beacon that he hoped never to use. Unlike the other students, he had no special abilities or enhanced physiology to rely on. Just human stubbornness and whatever he had learned from watching nature documentaries back on Earth. He jumped. The first day passed without major incident. Day moved carefully through the crystal maze, using techniques his grandfather had taught him about wilderness survival. He found water sources by watching the movement of small creatures, identified safe areas by testing air quality with strips of cloth, and navigated using stellar formations that remained constant despite the shifting terrain. By nightfall, he had covered 30 kilometers and was ahead of schedule for reaching the nearest extraction point. He made camp in a crystal cave that offered protection from the toxic storms that swept across the landscape after sunset. That's when he heard the screaming. The sounds came from the east, where atmospheric interference made communication impossible. Someone was in serious trouble, and their cries for help cut through the night air like broken glass. Day's mission was to reach extraction points, not to play rescue hero. Getting involved would only endanger his own survival. He packed his gear and headed toward the screaming. What he found was worse than he had expected. 2 Nexari students, Hansol and Min Wu, had fallen into a gravity well that had opened beneath their campsite. The crystalline beings were trapped in a depression where gravitational forces were slowly crushing their molecular structure. Their harmonic distress calls were what he had mistaken for screaming. Above them, a group of other students stood at the edge of the gravity well, arguing in multiple languages about what to do. A Vrathari warrior named Thokra insisted they should move on before the anomaly expanded. A golem student called Granite maintained that rescue was impossible without specialized equipment. 2 Centaurian engineering students calculated that any rescue attempt had less than 15% chance of success. "We have to leave them," Thokra declared. "The examination rules are clear. Individual survival only." "But they'll die," protested a young hive mind collective whose individual components were barely larger than insects. "Then they die," Granite rumbled with the cold logic of his species. "That is the nature of the test." Day studied the situation for several minutes, analyzing angles and force vectors, the way he had learned to approach complex problems back home. The gravity well was approximately 12 meters deep, with walls that sloped at 60-degree angles. The gravitational field was strongest at the center, but showed irregular fluctuations that suggested instability in the generation equipment. "I need rope," he announced. The other students turned to stare at him as if he had lost his mind. "Human," Thokra said with barely concealed contempt. "This is not your concern. Continue to extraction and save yourself." "I need rope," Day repeated, ignoring the advice, "and something to anchor it with." What followed was the strangest collaboration in Academy history. Day somehow convinced beings who had been trained from birth to compete rather than cooperate to work together on an impossible rescue mission. He used Centaurian engineering cable, Vrathari strength for anchoring points, and golem mass for counterweight systems. The rescue took 18 hours and nearly killed him twice. When he finally emerged from the gravity well with both Nexari students, he had less than 30 hours remaining to reach extraction points that were now over 100 kilometers away. Instead of heading directly to safety, Day organized the group of students into an efficient traveling formation. He taught them human concepts of teamwork that their individual species had never developed. How Vrathari strength could compensate for Nexari fragility, how Centaurian technical knowledge could guide golem endurance, how even tiny hive mind components could serve as scouts and early warning systems. They moved across the wilderness like a military unit, covering ground at speeds that should have been impossible for such a diverse group. When atmospheric storms struck, they sheltered. Together, and shared resources. When new gravity wells opened in their path, they worked together to find safe passages. On the final day, they encountered predators that the Academy had never mentioned in their briefings. Crystalline spiders the size of ground vehicles evolved, specifically to hunt intelligent prey in the maze. The creatures were nearly invisible against the crystal formations and attacked with coordination that suggested hive intelligence. The student group should have been scattered and picked off, one by one. Instead, under Day's quiet leadership, they fought like a coordinated military unit. Vrathari warriors provided heavy assault capabilities, while Nexari students used their resonance abilities to disrupt the spider's sensory systems. Centaurians calculated optimal firing solutions, while Golem students served as mobile cover. The HiveMind Collective coordinated communications across the entire battlefield. When rescue transports finally located them at the primary extraction point, they found something unprecedented in Academy history. 9 students from 6 different species, sitting around a campfire sharing rations and telling stories as if they had been friends for years instead of strangers who had met 3 days earlier. The extraction footage was analyzed frame by frame by Academy officials who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Day had not only survived the wilderness trial, but had transformed it into a leadership exercise that united species whose governments had been at war for centuries. Director Quantos reviewed the final reports in his private office, surrounded by holographic displays showing performance metrics that broke every curve the Academy had ever used for evaluation. Day had covered over 200 kilometers through lethal terrain, organized successful rescue operations, led a multi-species military unit against predators, and still reached extraction ahead of schedule. More disturbing was the psychological evaluation data. Every student who had worked with the human showed marked changes in their tactical thinking, cooperation protocols, and leadership potential. It was as if exposure to human methodology had unlocked capabilities in them that their own species had never developed. "We need to restructure everything," Quantos announced at the emergency faculty meeting that followed. "Our training protocols, our evaluation methods, our understanding of what makes an effective military leader. The human has demonstrated that our entire approach to warfare education is fundamentally flawed." The Academy's new curriculum, quietly implemented over the following months, became known as Terran Protocol. Students from across the galaxy were taught human concepts of adaptive leadership, species integration, and persistence under impossible odds. The mortality rate for final examinations dropped to 0 as students learned to work together instead of competing against each other. 6 months later, when Li Min arrived as the second human exchange student, she was greeted not with mockery, but with something approaching religious reverence. Faculty members who had dismissed humanity as primitive now studied human military history with the intensity of theological scholars. Students who had once bet on human failure now requested assignment to study groups led by human cadets. The galaxy had learned a fundamental truth that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Humans weren't primitive beings who had stumbled into space travel through luck or accident. They were apex predators from a death world who had simply been polite enough not to mention it until someone asked them to demonstrate their capabilities. And now that the galaxy knew what humans could do, everything had changed forever. The end.